Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, the pound-for-pound champion when it comes to saving animals is a little-known department at PETA that has saved millions of lives by modernizing the standards in government regulatory testing.
If you can knock out, for example, 10 chemicals from having to have that test conducted on them, there you've saved, 25,000 animals in one blow. And so that's why, PETA decided to work on this because it's massive, it's technical, it's deeply entrenched, and it's totally entangled in bureaucratic red tape. And also because the vast majority of the animals who are used in these experiments are mice and rats, although, of course, guinea pigs, rabbits, and dogs are also used in large numbers.
Jessica Sandler was just a one-person department 20 years ago at PETA. She saved millions of animals' lives because of her activism on multiple fronts against companies, government agencies, and even environmentalists, all of which didn't care enough about animals until Sandler and PETA made them. How did she do it? Well, it involved a bunny suit in one case, hounding Al Gore. We'll have that and other stories next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with your friends and let them know how the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. Go to our webpage at PETA.org and listen to all the episodes. There's the first episode with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk, who debunks all the myths you've heard about PETA and animal rights. Listen to what she has to say. And to find out more about animal experimentation on the other front, say the university or the curiosity front, check out episode 20, The Killing Labs, and episode 11, Vivisection Hell. It'll help you understand this current episode on testing that's done because of government regulation. And if you're wondering how racism and speciesism goes hand in hand, listen to PETA's Chief Counsel Jeff Kerr in episode 2. Get all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you catch your podcasts. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. And if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the donate button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Jessica Sandler was an expert when it came to hazardous materials in the workplace. She joined PETA nearly 20 years ago when she saw that needless experiments on animals were being done in the name of government regulations. Now, as the vice president of the department, she's helping corporations and government modernize their approaches. She leads a team of 15 scientists who come up with alternatives to animal testing that really make a difference to humans and to the millions of animals whose lives have been spared. Sandler tells me about the difficulty she's had to fight ignorance within the scientific, corporate, and environmental communities, and how change has come, sometimes with hard science, and sometimes because PETA had a man in a bunny suit hounding Vice President Al Gore. How Jessica Sandler and her department, by reforming government testing methods, has saved millions of animals. On this episode of the PETA Podcast. Can you even begin to imagine how many animals you've spared from poisoning deaths in labs? I mean, have you thought about that ever?
I do think about that, actually. I think about that a lot because there are so many animals in the field who are being used in the field that I work in. And yes.
So how many millions do you think?
Well, it's in the millions. We had one victory, I would guess about 5 years ago, that with one letter, we saved upwards of 4.5 million animals from being used in a European toxicity testing program. So we are talking about tens of millions. There's no question.
See, this is one of the things about what you do, because considering the lives that you've spared, people just aren't familiar with your department at PETA. They don't, and if you told it to them, well, it's the regulatory testing department, they'd say, well, what is the regulatory testing department at PETA?
Well, you're absolutely right, Emil. Most people are familiar with the other department at PETA that deals with animal experimentation, the one that deals with all the non-required testing, all the medical, university, and curiosity research. The regulatory testing department is the department that deals with all of the toxicity testing that is required to be conducted by government agencies, either here in the US or around the world. So basically, if a company wants to market a chemical, a pesticide, a drug, a vaccine, or a medical device, they are required to basically use hundreds of thousands of animals to test these products and substances before they can be marketed. And that's what my department of scientists works on.
So toxicity tests, and they're using animals to determine the toxicity to humans, which to maybe people who aren't familiar might seem like, oh yeah, of course they would do that. But if you've covered any of this, even as from a layman's point of view, and you know the basics of, well, let's see, toxic testing on animals versus what it means to humans, you know that's illogical, or it doesn't necessarily make sense, at least in terms of, you know, what happens to an animal isn't necessarily what will happen to a human in a testing situation. So what is the value of these toxicity tests?
Well, that's a good question. And if I could for a moment just talk about my own background, because that's pretty much what led me to working in this field.
Sure.
Because my background is actually in worker safety and health. I worked for a number of years for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, protecting workers from being exposed to harmful chemicals. And what I saw there really led to this work with PETA, because I saw protections for workers being delayed in many cases because the government preferred to rely on the results of animal tests rather than see what was actually going on in the exposed population. So, for example, I saw workers dying from chromium and benzene poisoning and whole populations affected by arsenic in drinking water, yet the animals in the laboratories who were being tested on for these very same substances weren't being affected in the same ways. And the perfect example of that, of course, is cigarette smoking. So you have the tobacco industry for decades was able to question what we were seeing in humans and delay acceptance of the link between smoking and cancer, because it doesn't matter how many times you cut holes in beagles' throats and force them to inhale concentrated tobacco smoke, as was done for decades. The animals don't develop the lung cancer that humans do.
So are we at a point, though, where considering all that and what you've seen personally, firsthand, and all these tests that show that animals, you know, that it just doesn't equate when you test on an animal and then you try to apply it to, you know, in situations with humans. Can't we say conclusively that those animal tests are just worthless? Aren't we at that point yet, or shouldn't we be at that point yet?
Well, we are certainly getting to that point. You know, and I would certainly argue this issue from both the scientific standpoint, which you just expressed, and also the ethical standpoint, of course, because we are people for the ethical treatment of animals. But
Right.
Yes, basically in 2000, largely because of the work that started when I began at PETA in 1998. And all the work that we did with the Environmental Protection Agency at that time. In 2007, the EPA commissioned the National Academy of Sciences to look at the way chemicals are tested and to see what could be done to improve it. And the National Research Council came out with a landmark report in 2007 called Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century, a Vision and a Strategy, that basically said everything that we had been saying for the previous decade, which was that using animals to try to determine what the hazards of chemicals are to humans was not working. It was very slow, very ineffective, and that basically with all the animals in the world, you could not determine the hazards of the chemicals that really need to be tested and determined. Basically, in the last quarter century, there's basically been a sea change that has taken place in our understanding of how biological processes work. And this has allowed for the development of a whole slew of testing methods that can look directly at cellular mechanisms rather than at the crude, what we call black box results that come from using animals. Basically, toxicologists will call it the feet up, feet down method. You poison an animal, the animal lives or dies, and you don't know exactly what's going on. And these much more sophisticated non-animal methods, they're faster, they're cheaper, they're more reliable. So there has been a vast change just in the amount of time that I've been working on these issues.
Well, tell me, would that sea change have happened if it weren't for the pushing by activists like you and PETA? I mean, would we even be as far as we are now?
Of course we wouldn't be. Of course, I mean, PETA.
Wait a minute. There's also the profit motive too. I mean, if it costs less to do it, wouldn't they eventually get around to it? Or am I just being too idealistic there?
No, I mean, the companies themselves have been developing these methods. The problem with regulatory testing is getting the government agencies that oversee these regulations to accept the animal test results. And that's really where PETA's pushing over the decades has really moved us. I mean, basically the EPA in 1998 hadn't even considered that animal protection organizations might be interested in an absolutely massive animal testing program that they were developing together with an environmental organization and Al Gore at the time. I mean, we weren't notified of the program. There was no public notice and comment. And when we found out about it, we were told, oh, don't worry, the environmental organizations will address your issues, which was obviously not the case since they had been pushing for this massive animal testing program. And yet now you have the EPA basically working with PETA. You have PETA scientists working with EPA scientists. You have them publishing together. You have them doing training on non-animal methods together. So there's been a real revolution in how this is viewed.
When we talked about the size and the scope of this, the animals saved, this is every nook and cranny of society, right? Where anyone who uses any kind of chemical has to get tested for business or for I guess, any part or any aspect of society has to get the stamp of approval. Is that it pretty much?
Yeah, it's not the user, it's the manufacturer or the marketer who has to do this testing, but it is in every aspect. And it's one of the reasons that PETA started working on this issue. It's because the numbers of animals who are used are so vast. And so, for example, I'll give you one example. There's a particular test, a developmental toxicity test that uses somewhere around 1,200 to 1,600 animals every time it is conducted. And it is conducted very, very frequently. So if you can knock out, for example, 10 chemicals from having to have that test conducted on them, there you've saved 25,000 animals in one blow. And so that's why, PETA decided to work on this despite the fact, and also maybe not despite the fact, maybe because of the fact that no other group was willing to address this area of animal experimentation because it is it's massive, it's technical, it's deeply entrenched, and it's totally entangled in bureaucratic red tape. And also because the vast majority of the animals who are used in these experiments are mice and rats, although, of course, guinea pigs, rabbits, and dogs are also used in large numbers.
So it's really easy for someone, even someone who's a feeling and caring and empathetic person, to say, "Oh, what the heck? Just go ahead and test. We need the chemicals, right? Or we need whatever product that the corporations are selling to us." And so this thing always got shunted aside or looked. It wasn't given the kind of care. Is that what you're saying?
You're presupposing that you're making a presupposition that I wouldn't necessarily be willing to go along with, which is that the animal tests determine what the hazards are going to be to humans. So if you're talking about the animal tests that are being used today, most of them have roots go back to not even World War II, but World War I. So we're using some of the same animal tests that were developed such a long time ago. And if you think about the types of other things that were being used back at the time of World War I, what was it? Carrier pigeons to relay messages, or cast iron typewriters that I actually grew up on. And if you think,
I love those.
Look at the vast change in those methods from that time until now. Why is it suddenly acceptable then to be using the same methods to determine hazards? Toxicity testing hazards that we were using back then. Look at word processors. Look at how things have changed.
Well, look, my point was only that because it's such a vast area and the bureaucracy is so large and it's such a pain in the butt, right? And also using the kind of animals that get tested, that I was just saying that it means that the chances of it being prioritized or being, people like raising their hands, volunteering for this, are not high, right? This is probably something people, even good people, would say, "Oh, well, we need the chemicals. We need the."
Well, right. Okay. I understand what you're saying. But so this is why we had to take a completely different approach to working on this issue than what is done with the non-required testing that I mentioned when we first started. When you have non-required testing, what PETA has to do is to shine a light on the horrors and the fraud and get the vivisectors funding pulled. And that's what PETA has done in that area. But in this particular area, you have to take a different approach because the government is always going to require data on the hazards of marketed substances. So we had to set about making corporations and government agencies actually change their testing methods, and not because they cared about animal suffering, but because we would force them to conclude that the animal tests were not effective at protecting humans and the environment. And of course, doing that meant arming ourselves with good scientists and hard science. And basically, that's why this department has gone from one person, me, 20 years ago, to PETA has probably about 15 scientists now working on these issues around the world.
Well, you'd think that given the science and given the old science or archaic methods, you'd think that it might be easier to move toward your goal of getting people to see that what they're doing is just a waste of time.
Well, absolutely. And that's what's been happening in the last 20 years. It's what PETA, that's what we've been calling attention to. It's what the National Academy of Sciences report that the EPA commissioned called attention to. And that's why you're seeing things, the change really speed up nowadays, because obviously these high-tech methods are clearly better than using, terrified, neurotic, and sick animals, to test substances.
But in the beginning, without the high tech, what did you have to rely on? What kind of tactics did you find worked or didn't work when you're out there trying to get the government and corporations to move toward a more humane type of science or practice?
Well, that's what I was saying previously, is that you can't just say, don't do the testing. because this is not curiosity research. This is required testing. So you have to be able to replace the animal tests with non-animal methods. It's not always a one-to-one replacement, one non-animal test to replace one animal test. It could be a whole battery of in vitro tests replacing the animal tests, but you have to have non-animal methods available. And that's also where we come in, because we also do massively fund the development of the non-animal tests that are needed to replace the animal tests. So, for example, we funded the final development of a non-animal skin irritation and corrosion test, which is now accepted throughout the entire world to replace the use of rabbits in skin corrosion and skin irritation testing. So it isn't just as simple as, beating up on a government agency. You have to be able to provide them with the alternatives. That with the non-required testing, the alternative can often be just don't do it. With the required testing, that's not an option. We have to be able to provide the non-animal test methods that will replace and vastly improve on the animal testing methods.
All right, now tell me, I hear there's a story about Al Gore and a giant bunny. Well, this is serious stuff, but there every now and then there's an interesting story. This one deals with Al Gore and a bunny. What was that?
Well, that's actually when I started, when I left my government job protecting workers and started with PETA, was because PETA found out through a company, through a corporation, that the Environmental Protection Agency was about to launch, together with a so-called environmental organization, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Al Gore, who was vice president at the time, an absolutely massive animal testing program, basically to test and retest hundreds of thousands. Well, I'm trying to think how many. Maybe it was, it wasn't hundreds of thousands. It was 3,000 of the most commonly used industrial chemicals. And that's when I decided to take the jump over to working for PETA, because I looked at PETA sent me the list of chemicals. And as a specialist in hazardous chemicals, I looked at the list and I said, this is crazy. There are chemicals on this list that we've known for decades are extremely toxic, and which I've been taking off workplace shelves for, not 5 or 10 years, but for 20 years. And then there are other substances on this list, like fatty acids, which we know are not going to cause harm if people are exposed to them. So that's how I got started with PETA. That's how PETA got started in this whole realm of regulatory toxicity testing. Now, it just so happened that time-wise, Al Gore was actually running in the Democratic primary at the time. And I was trying to get meetings with the White House's environmental liaison so that we could discuss this program and try to make some changes to it. It was very late in the process. The program was just about to launch. And no one was accepting my calls or getting back to me on meetings. So PETA decided to put a PETA staffer in a 6-foot bunny outfit with a sign that said, I believe either, stop the Gore E-tests. Or Gore burn bunny lose votes. And that rabbit followed Al Gore around to every single one of his campaign stops. And and every time the bunny came out, I would get a call from the White House's environmental liaison basically saying, what can we do to make the bunny go away? And so we started having meetings with their science side. They were not happy in the beginning, but they came to respect our science and what we were saying. And, thank dog for the rabbit. I mean, that rabbit, I have to tell you, Al Gore went on vacation. He took a break, and that rabbit got a rowboat and rode out to the island where Al Gore was vacationing. And there was,
really?
Yeah, there were pictures in the local paper of that. And I remember one case where the poor rabbit was standing at a campaign event in probably 100+ degree heat, and the rabbit passed out and had to be revived by the Secret Service. So,
see, they care. They're compassionate people. The Secret Service.
Yes, indeed, they are.
So this is Al Gore and the bunny. That's kind of funny. It's amazing. I guess would that tactic work today?
Well, like I said, we were really lucky in the coincidence of the timing of the Democratic primary. I mean, that I do think is one of PETA's major strengths, which is the ability to look at all aspects of an issue and address it from all aspects. So, like I said, no one was paying attention to our scientific arguments until the rabbit came out, until PETA initiated an absolutely massive grassroots campaign. And yes, these tactics do still work today, as evidenced by all the, major changes that have happened.
All right. Now tell me about this coincidence of Al Gore and, he was part of the Environmental Defense Fund, right? He was on the board, you were saying?
I don't know that he was on the board, but it was this triumvirate. It was an effort by Environmental Defense, the EPA, and Al Gore to launch this program.
Tell me about what this may say about the conflict between environmentalists and animal rights folks, because they were willing to test on any number of millions of animals, and PETA was ready to speak on behalf of the animals. What does it say about the conflict there between the environmentalists and animal rights people?
Okay, I will try to answer this as calmly as I am able to, because I have many years of dealing with scientists at environmental organizations who, and I'm going to be honest here, have basically not bothered to educate themselves on either the issue of animal testing or the ways in which non-animal test methods can be far superior to using animals. And I'll give you just a couple examples. I was at a conference a number of years ago on a particular type of testing. This testing required massive numbers of animals, and everyone basically agreed that it was a joke, that it had to do with, again, developmental toxicity testing. You poison the mothers, you take the babies after they're born, and I'm going to give you this example. You put them on a hot plate, and you see how many times the baby flicks his or her tail. And somehow that is supposed to correspond to children who are exposed to pesticides in utero. I walked out of this one particular talk with the chief scientist from one of the major environmental organizations. And I said to her, come on, are you not embarrassed by that? Are you by the science of that? And she looked at me and she said, no, it's better than nothing, and walked off. And the other thing I have learned from these environmental organizations over the years is that they basically believe that there is a species of animals known as laboratory animals. And basically you can do anything you want to these animals because somehow they're magically different than every other animal in the world. So I forgot what the question is, but that's basically my response.
Well, it was about the lack of an alliance between the environmentalists and the animal rights people on issues such as this, and how it shows that there's a kind of rift sometimes between these two groups that should be more empathetic and should be more allied, but aren't. And I guess that would just be the assumption one would make. But it's not true that you not only fight the big corporations, but you'll also fight the environmental groups.
Yes, we will. And I would say that most of the animal activists are serious environmentalists, if for no other reason that they're following a plant-based diet. And but the animal rights component is often severely lacking in many environmental organizations. And we once did an analysis of this, and people can see it on a PETA website called www.meangreenies.com.
Meangreenies.com, huh?
Yes. And we went to all the big environmental groups at the time and we had a number of questions that related to animal rights issues. And you can see the report cards that they each received on that site. The report card grades.
Yeah, I think it would be kind of surprising because, as I said, most people would think that the animal rights groups and the environmentalists would be allied. But all right, so that's one front that animal rights groups and who are standing up for these animals who are being tested on are fighting. But on another front are the corporations, the chemical manufacturers, the Fortune 100 companies. What do they like to battle, or what do they like to work with?
Well, let's I thought your question is telling. It did start out as a battle with these corporations, and it's more of in many cases, it's more of a working collaborative relationship at this point. Basically, how we started working with corporations on these issues is people are probably, by and large, familiar with the fact that in the 1980s, PETA used shareholder resolutions to target cosmetic and household product manufacturers that conducted animal tests. When I came on board, we actually started using that tactic against some of the biggest chemical and pharmaceutical companies. And yes, it was very confrontational in the beginning. They would come to the meetings because they wanted the shareholder resolution to go away. Maybe if you're a shareholder of let's say a fur company, you pretty much know what your company is doing to animals. But if you're a shareholder of a company, just to give an example, like General Electric, you may not know necessarily that your company is using animals in experiments. And so, and they could be using them in very disturbing ways, such as other companies who are using dogs in pesticide testing. So they would come to the table, they would meet with us, but they were very unhappy about doing so. I remember some of the first meetings with some of the biggest corporations were held in secret hotel rooms. They wouldn't come to the PETA office, and we certainly weren't allowed to come to their offices. And whether or not that was because they were worried about being taped, I don't know. But now they come to the PETA office. We've had tours of some of their facilities. So there's also been a major change in the way these corporations view us in many cases.
Well, it's probably goes back to what I was hitting at in the early part of the conversation, that because these tests, or by getting rid of animal tests or doing alternatives, it could be more cost effective, and it could be not just cost effective from the standpoint of putting out a product, but in terms of protecting workers or protecting the public, and protecting the corporation from lawsuits. It's just a better test that you offer them, right?
Yeah, I'll give you an example if you don't mind, Emil. The EPA had asked a major corporation that everyone listening to on this podcast is very familiar with. They had asked them to do a test in which the substance is applied to the animals through the skin, and then you see whether the animals get sick, whether they die from absorbing the substance through the skin and having it affect them in a systemic fashion. And the company was not happy about doing it, but they were being told by the EPA to do this, so they didn't feel that they had much choice. And we were talking to them, and I remember I said, well, hang on a second. Well, hold on a minute. Do you know if the chemical is absorbed through the skin? Do you even know? And they said, well, no, we haven't determined that. So we discussed the fact that there are very relatively simple non-animal and accepted non-animal ways to determine whether a substance is absorbed through the skin. So we said to them, well, how about you just do those non-animal methods to see if it's even absorbed through the skin? And then let's talk. So they went and they did that testing and they came back and they said, you were right. We did the testing and it's not absorbed. It doesn't cross the skin barrier. So they went back to EPA and said, hey, EPA, do we still have to kill these animals when we've definitively shown through methods that you already accept that the substance doesn't cross the skin barrier? And of course, the EPA said, no, you don't need to do that animal test, therefore. And we actually ended up, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine actually ended up publishing with this corporation on this method of avoiding animal tests, which was eventually officially accepted by the EPA.
Well, it sounds like you got to convince the EPA or the regulatory agency first, but it helps if you have a little muscle from the corporations too, right? So
absolutely, yeah,
yeah, because it sounds like, are we still in the realm of that CYA type of mentality where, well, like you were talking earlier about the the environmentalists saying, well, this is the best that we've got, or this is the best that we could do, that it may not be laziness, but in lieu of nothing, here's a thing that we can put on paper and maybe get a bureaucrat's rubber stamp. Is it that kind of science, or is it, I don't know. It just sounds like if you know that animals are irrelevant when it comes to predicting what might happen to human beings, that it'd be easy to get rid of tests and maybe come up with those alternatives.
Yes. And you would think that a corporation that has mucho bucks and that has highly, highly paid scientists would have figured this particular case out on their own. But honestly, and there are many good scientists at private companies, but the PETA scientists are the ones who really, really care about sparing as many animals as we can, and who are going to look at every single possibility to spare animals. And I just have to say that, animals die for the stupidest reasons. Animals die because people are ignorant, because people are lazy. They just die for the stupidest reasons.
So it can't be easy knowing that fact, and that they've died and that they're going to die in all these tests that don't even protect humans. So as we wrap up here, how does someone like yourself deal with that fact? How do you deal with the fact that, there's only one of you? Well, you have 14 other people in your department now, one of the biggest at PETA. How do you deal with that idea that the suffering, that there's suffering that goes on when you don't get a victory, and that it's going to continue to go on until you can make that kind of headway to change some minds?
That is obviously, I would say, the hardest part of this work for anyone working on these issues. And having to make decisions that really are life and death to many thousands of animals is a pretty terrible thing to have to contemplate. It's just something that you deal with, whether it means, closing off your heart so that you don't think about this all the time. One of the things that is helpful to me personally in this work, I could not do, for example, the work that is done in the other animal experimentation department at PETA, where there are actual individuals. That and this just happened recently, these 10 primates have been left to languish in a basement of a company that the company no longer wants to use them. And so they're basically just left in a basement, living, in their cages while everyone else's life goes on. Those animals are stuck there. And those are individuals I am saved in part, my sanity is saved in part by, even though it's maybe because it's large numbers of animals, I don't have to think of them as individuals. I somehow am able to avoid it. I'm saying this even though it kills me every time we lose a battle. I mean, it's soul crushing, but it's just the way it is. And you just keep going and doing the best you can for as many animals as you can.
Okay. It's hard. I just did an interview with Emily Trundle over there at LID about those other kinds of tests. And she's describing, the use of the guillotine, in the experiments that do, well, as a pre-PhD, her experiments do nothing except give her a degree, right? That they're not for humankind. They don't further anything. And, just to hear her talk about what she had to do and how she came to, an awareness that she had to get out of that field. I'm learning a lot more about these tests. I've managed to coexist with these tests, but I guess I'm maybe closer to the ignorant public that says, "Oh, well, I guess that's going on." And when I talk further with people like yourself and find out more about what my spouse does for a living, that it's sobering.
It is sobering, and we do try to take every opportunity to educate people about this. One of the dogs who lives with me is from a laboratory that PETA shut down. We had an undercover investigator inside this contract testing laboratory for, I think, about 6 months. And 1 or 2 weeks after we brought the footage out, it was so horrific that the laboratory shut its doors and released all 250 dogs and cats whom they had been using. And she's an adorable, sweet beagle mix. And when people stop along the trail when I'm walking her to pat her, I always say, "Oh, she's rescued from a laboratory." And people generally are horrified to find out, for example, the dog. Oh, I thought that hadn't been conducted. I didn't realize people were still doing that. I didn't. Yeah. People don't know, and also I think we really need to avoid this trap that I mentioned with environmental organizations of thinking that some animals are different than other animals. And if I could just go back for a moment, Emil, to your question about working with companies, because I would like to use this example to illustrate a change. I was working with one company. I was in a meeting, and the company was using dogs in pesticide testing as they were required to do. And the head toxicologist I was dealing with was getting close to retirement. And at one point in the meeting, he leaned over, we were sitting next to each other, and he sort of patted me on the back. And he said to me, now you do understand, my dear, that we are not talking about pet dogs. And to which I replied I actually paraphrased Ingrid's famous quote, and I said, sorry, but a dog is a dog is a dog is a dog. I'm happy to report that after that fellow retired, the company brought in a young fellow who was very gung-ho on the in vitro methods. Things changed very rapidly at that place. And we have since actually gotten the US, the European Union, Canada, and Japan to do away with one of the backbone tests for pesticides, which involve poisoning dogs over the course of an entire year. So, that's just to give you a last optimistic bit of news.
So it's generational, really. The guy who is gung-ho about in vitro, and it indicates that maybe the time is now.
The time is definitely always now, Emil. It's always now to do away with that. It's always now to do away with animal testing.
It was now 20 years ago, even.
That's correct.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Emil.
Jessica Sandler, PETA's Vice President of Regulatory Testing, and the ongoing fight to modernize government methods, and by doing so, how that effort saves more animals than any single department at PETA. It's the other side of animal testing, the regulatory side, versus the curiosity research side. You know, the vivisectors in universities like Texas A&amp, for example. They all take animals' lives, and you can take action. Go to PETA.org. Read up about Texas A&amp, read up about what Sandler's department does, and see what Sandler means about the environmentalists. You can go to meangreenies.com or check out the links in the show notes. And that's our show for today. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok or on amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.